This weekend, millions of Jews and Messianics throughout the world will, in one form or another, endeavor to observe Passover. Some will endeavor to celebrate Passover by way of Jewish tradition such as the Seder, while others will go the route of keeping Passover with the original covenant in mind. Many of us will endeavor to keep Passover by way of the renewed covenant, that is, in spirit and in truth. Well, in this three-part installment of TMTO's Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections, yes, 3 parts. Well, we will discuss the many ways people will keep Passover this year, the year of 2022, as well as we will discuss the way that Yah's set-apart people should and will keep Passover in spirit and in truth. Shalom and welcome. Shabbat Shalom and welcome, saints of the Most High. Welcome to the Messianic Torah Observers Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections. I'm Rod Thomas, and I want to thank you for fellowshipping with me here on this blessed day of rest, this holy weekend, this set-apart time in Yah's biblical calendar. Many call it the spring feast. Well, it is here on these days, these Sabbaths, these high holy days, these convocation days, these set-apart days. It is here that we gather to delve in Jehovah's or into Jehovah's eternal words of life, his instructions in righteousness, which is our constitution and the foundation for our covenant relationship with the Creator of the universe. And as always, beloved, it is our hope, trust, and prayer that this installment of the Messianic Torah Observers Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections finds you and your families and fellowships well and blessed. We pray and we trust that you are having a blessed and meaningful month of the Aviv as we all head headlong, as we kind of like a freight train that's coming right at us, going right into Passover Day, or Pesach, however you pronounce it. I'm not a Hebrew guy. I had Hillary trying to school me the other day on how to pronounce it. She's learned Hebrew, and I've just been hesitant, if not almost resistant, to learning Hebrew. At my age, I don't think so. It's just, I just have a block. Like I said before in many other posts, I've tried multiple times to set about learning Hebrew, but I've failed miserably at every stance. So I'll let her have that auspicious distinction in our family of being the Hebrew expert, let's just say. I have a lot to cover today. So let's get right into it, will you? Like I said, this is going to, let's just get into it. And without further ado, this is some Passover basics, and it is the first installment of a 3-part series I chose to entitle Keeping Passover and Unleavened Bread in 2022. For those of us who keep the observational calendar, Passover, or Pesach, will take place this year on Sunday, and I hate using the Roman calendar month names and the days of the week names, but in order to kind of lessen the confusion, because unfortunately we're kind of forced, as we are sojourners in this pagan land and in this pagan time, pagan ripe time of ours, I'm going to have to refer to these pagan names. So I'm breaking my own rules. So Sunday, this Sunday evening, April 14th, 2022, with the first day of Hag HaMatzah, or unleavened bread, will commence at sundown on the same Sunday, and then extending out through sundown on Sunday, April 24th, 2022. And then Yom Hanafat HaOmer, or the day of the wave sheaf offering, will also fall on Sunday, April 24th, 2022. Now, we really cannot keep Yom Hanafat HaOmer, or the day of the wave sheaf offering, in the fashion that Yah passed down to us in Leviticus or Vayikra chapter 23. So for us, the day serves as more of a marker. It is the day that we begin our 7 Sabbath or 7-week count toward Shavuot, or which is otherwise known as Pentecost. And we will discuss that day of Shavuot as well in upcoming discussions, as well as probably next installment, Abba willing, we'll discuss this whole idea of counting, the counting of the Omers, as it is known in rabbinic circles, or just the counting of weeks leading up to Shavuot, how that all plays out in the calendar and things of that nature. It may be one of the shorter discussions than we're used to. But it's, like I said, it serves as a marker. It gives us a place to start counting towards Shavuot, and there's some other amazing things that factor into that whole counting thing that we'll discuss in future installments. But for some of us, it also serves as a day in which we give of the first of our increase. It's a special offering that is not the tithe. And we often give to whatever ministries or organizations or thing, whatever that we are led to give in honor and thanksgiving to Yah for blessing and increasing and sustaining us throughout the year. I'll also touch upon, as we get into, I believe, the third part of this overall 3-part discussion, other aspects of the wave sheaf offering or the day of wave sheaf offering that doesn't necessarily pertain to the giving of funds, the giving of money. There are other ways to worship Father in the giving department on that special set-apart day that don't necessarily have to do with the exchanging of money, giving money to ministries and things of that nature. We'll talk about that in the third installment. Now, for those of you who keep the Jewish calendar, what I call the calculated Jewish calendar, Pesach, or Passover, will take place this year on Friday evening, April 15th, 2022, which is generally noted as the first Seder night, or Erev Pesach, the night before Passover. And then, of course, that same night at sundown commences the 7-day week of Passover, also referred to in rabbinic circles as the second Seder night. This day also commences the 50-day counting of the Omer, which is not biblical, but it does serve the purpose of pointing us towards Shavuot, as we just mentioned with the observational calendar. Why do we differ in our determination of the wave sheaf, day of wave sheaf, Yom Hanafat HaOmer, or the start of the counting of the Omer? Why is there this difference, this disparity? Well, that's a rather complicated issue that I will reserve for that post that we'll talk about with the counting of the Omer. Abba willing, next weekend, next posting after this 3-part series, we'll talk about why we have this disparity. But the last day of Passover on the Jewish calendar, on the Jewish calculated calendar, is set for sundown on Shabbat of April 23rd, 2022. So I hope we have the dates all figured out. If you really want to get a kind of a visual about the calendar or something like that kind of orient you, because it does get a little bit confusing. Some of you may have access, depending on which calendar you keep. If you're dealing with the observational calendar, such as what I keep, what Hillary and I keep, the Messianic TorahObserver.org, I have a calendar on the website that I will put the links to so that you can get to it on this post. Just going over to the Messianic TorahObserver.org. Click down that at the very top, you have those, I think those are called menus at the very top underneath our logo. The essential elements of the Messianic Hebraic faith, click that. And if you go and scroll all the way down toward the bottom of that page, you will see the latest calendar that I made up for your reference. So check that out if you need a visual reference. I also have on that same page, just above that calendar, observational calendar on that page, a hyperlink to Chabad.org. Chabad.org, Chabad, and you'll find the calculated Jewish calendar there. Just follow and look for on the right-hand side of the landing page on Chabad.org, and you'll see a link to the calendar. And that way you'll be able to kind of sort that out as well. So we're kind of operating on two different calendars. But regardless, we are still going to press forward. We're still brothers and sisters in the one true faith, once delivered. And the calendar is just one thing that Father's going to fix. Master will reveal to us when he comes, I believe, and we'll be all on the same page then. But let's get beyond the calendar issues for now. We did discuss calendar issues a couple installments ago, as well as I also did a blog post. I'll put the links to those in the transcript of this post for your reference as well. So let's discuss how many feasts are involved in the Passover panoply of feasts. There's actually a number of feasts, and depending on what orientation you are, if you're following a rabbinic Jewish paradigm, there's a number of it's broken down into just a handful of feasts, or if you're like me, we really get deep into it, and there may tend to be more individual feasts than under the rabbinic. So let's discuss that. There are various opinions as to how many feasts or festivals we are supposed to honor each year. Those of our faith community who tend to be more on the Messianic Jewish side of the aisle, so to speak, will contend that there are just five of what they call Jewish holidays. 5 of them with the Jewish holidays of Purim and Hanukkah added well after the Torah was given. So what are these 5 feasts from the Torah? Well, there's Passover. And the thing about Passover is, and if you go to Leviticus chapter 23, you'll see all of the feasts delineated. Every single one of them delineated in their respective manner and by their respective name. But here for Passover Day and the 7 days of unleavened bread are all one, or treated as all one. Leviticus breaks them into two separate events. Passover day and 7 days of unleavened bread. But in rabbinic circles, Passover is all 8 days. Then we have the second one in the rabbinic line of Shavuot, also known as Pentecost, separate day, number 2. Number 3, Yom Teruah, also known as the Day of the Blowing of Trumpets, or the Day of Trumpets, or the Feast of Trumpets, which these insist is also called Rosh Hashanah. We talked about Rosh Hashanah in a previous installment. I'll put the links to that in the transcripts of that of this post if you're so interested. And we talked about in that post that under the rabbinic paradigm, under the rabbinic calendar, Yom Teruah, or the first day of the 7th month, the month they call Tishri, the Babylonian month of Tishri, is when the rabbis declare it as Rosh Hashanah, the head of the civil year, the head of the civil biblical calendar year. Rosh Hashanah, biblically, however, or as they say, the ecclesiastic year, falls on Aviv 1, the first month of the year. And for us, we just 2 weeks ago, exactly, celebrated Rosh Hashanah, biblical Rosh Hashanah. So, but you will see in your many readings and in your exposure to some teachings, rabbinic teachings, you'll come across that the day of the blowing of trumpets, Yom Teruah, is Rosh Hashanah, but that is not accurate. Just so you know, just as an aside. Then number 4, the number 4 feast day is Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. And lastly is Sukkot, also known as the Feast of Tabernacles, which also includes Shemini Atzeret, the 8th day. Again, this is all outlined individually in Leviticus chapter 23. But under the rabbinic order, there's only 5 feasts. Okay? Now, I've always contended that there are at least 7 mandated feasts of Yah. I've said that countless times throughout the many times we've discussed the feast on this program. And here's how I track those days. Here's how many feast days, the individual feast days, in rough compliance with Leviticus 23, let's just say. The first day is Passover day. The second day is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or Yom, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is also called Chag HaMatzah. Okay, 7 days. 7 days. That's the second one. The third is Shavuot, also known as Pentecost. And the fourth is Yom Teruah, also known as the Day of the Blowing of Trumpets. And it is not again Rosh Hashanah. Number 5, Yom Kippur, also known as the Day of Atonement. Number 6, the 7-day Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot. And number 7, Shemini Atzeret, or otherwise known as the Last Great Day. Now, of these 7 feasts that I've outlined, there are 3 pilgrimage feasts. 3. Pilgrimage feasts were the set-apart days that our ancient Hebrew cousins were mandated to, wherever they resided in the land of Israel, were required to pack up their belongings and make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to celebrate that feast. One of the 3 feasts, all 3 of the feasts, each calendar year. Many had to be represented by at least the head of the household, the father, the husband, would go forth. Sometimes he would end up taking his whole family with him, depending on their particular situation. But at the very minimum, it was required that the head of household represent his home, his household, on each of those 3 annual pilgrimage feasts. And those are the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread. Add to it the day of Passover. You needed to be there for the Passover. And then you're there for the 7 days of unleavened bread. That's number 1 pilgrimage feast. Number 2 pilgrimage feast is 50 days later after Pesach or Passover, and that's at that's at Pentecost, Shavuot. That's number 2. And last is during the Feast of Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles. And you stay there for 7 days, and then you add an additional day of Shemini Atzeret, or the last great day. That's the day that you break down everything and you get ready to head home. So there were 3 pilgrimage feasts. So we don't keep pilgrimage feasts anymore because we don't have a functioning temple in which to pilgrim to, or to make a pilgrimage to, let's just say. But this is something to keep in mind as we prepare to receive and keep the coming spring feast. Now, contrary to our rabbinic cousins, I do not include Purim, the man-made holiday of Purim, nor do I include Hanukkah in the count of the Feast of Yah. And I don't do that because they are Jewish instituted holidays. They're national holidays that Yah did not convey to us in his Torah. There's nothing wrong with Yah's people celebrating them or honoring them. I've talked about this on a number of posts, in a number of discussions. And in many of us in the Messianic community do keep these two holidays, these 2 national holidays, but they're not mandated to do so. So many of us do not keep them, and that's okay as well. So we have that opportunity presented to us to keep them or not keep them. But they are not mandated by Torah. These are purely nationalistic holidays. So having set that ground, outlining the biblical calendar and the Moedim contained on that annual calendar, some view these set-apart days collectively as simply holy days that God's people are obligated to keep. And those who hold such a perspective will keep each of these days by way of enacting or keeping the associated Jewish traditions. Now, I talked about Jewish traditions and the concerns that underscore many Jewish traditions. We talked about Takano. This was all in I believe it was our last installment, but I will go ahead and put the link to that installment in the transcript to this discussion for your convenience. But we talked about Takanot or Takana. These are traditions and laws that carry with them the authority and strength of Torah, Yah's Torah. So there are traditions that are dangerous in that respect. And we have to be able to distinguish which of those traditions and laws are of Torah and which are not. However, there are a great many Jewish traditions that are simply that, traditions, where there is nothing wrong with keeping such Jewish traditions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we continue along. Now, others view these set-apart days from more of a rabbinic standpoint. That being collectively, these days portray or are emblematic of Jehovah, Yahweh, Yahuwah, as the bridegroom marrying Yisrael, marrying Israel, by extension us. That is the successive steps of an ancient Hebrew wedding and marriage. Let's break this down for the spring feast of Passover. So, according to this marriage paradigm, Pesach represents the bridegroom, Jehovah, choosing and then redeeming his bride to be Israel. So Yah pays the bride's father a dowry, so to speak. And we know that one of the central themes of Pesach, apart from that of freedom, is redemption. We talked about that last installment. This concept of being redeemed. The Passover highlighting this concept of Israel being redeemed, and by extension, we being redeemed. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we continue along in this discussion as well. But the price to redeem the bride in the case of Passover, the very first Passover, mind you, that price to redeem the bride Israel was the blood of the Pesach, the Passover lamb, the unblemished lamb Yisrael would choose every 10th day of the first month of the Aviv. That was the price of Israel's redemption. Now, moving into the summer feast of Shavuot, which generally falls around the June-ish time frame. And of course, Shavuot is more popularly known as Pentecost. Well, Shavuot represents the ketubah. The ketubah. Now, a ketubah is essentially a Hebrew marriage contract, and it would stipulate the terms of the pending marriage agreement between the bridegroom, Yah, and his bride, Israel. In other words, it spelled out the rules of the marriage. Well, tradition has it that Yah spoke to the Hebrew nation his Torah from Mount Sinai on Shavuot, on Pentecost. And recall that Shavuot is 7 weeks after Passover. Therefore, Torah can be likened unto that of the marriage ketubah between Yah and Yisrael. The ketubah should be viewed as, or I should say, should not be viewed. The ketubah should not be viewed as just a set of rules that govern the marriage, but rather a love letter from the bridegroom, Yah, to his bride, Yisrael. And so, as long as the bride would remain faithful to her husband, Yah would pledge his undying protection and love for her. Then we go into the fall feast of Yah. Now, granted, the Bible never talks about spring feast, summer feast, and fall feast. These are just paradigms to help us group the feast into their general seasons, the seasons as we understand them here in the West. So these are just markers, just to kind of orient us. Okay? So we're now talking about the aspect of the feast that of the marriage paradigm as illustrated in the fall feast, and we're up to Yom Teruah, more popularly referred to as the Feast of Trumpets. And in Messianic Jewish circles, this feast, Yom Teruah, represents Jehovah's impassioned call to his unfaithful wife, Yisrael. The day represents Yah's willingness to forgive his cheating spouse, Yisrael. And all he requires of her is that she teshuvah, that she return to her first love, that she repent of her cheating ways, and then abide with the original terms of the ketubah that was given when she married Yah back at Mount Sinai. Then we have the Day of Atonement, otherwise known as Yom Kippur. And this represents in the marriage paradigm the return and cleansing of the once unfaithful bride Israel. And she returns now and is cleansed and repatriated, if you will, brought back to her husband, her waiting husband, Yehovah. And then finally, Sukkot. And remember, Sukkot consists of the 7 days of the Feast of Tabernacles and the last great day, or Shemini Atzeret. And this is popularly referred to as the Feast of Tabernacles. And under the marriage paradigm, it is emblematic of the marriage being consummated. And the happy couple, Yehovah and Yisrael, Yehovah being the bridegroom, Yisrael being the bride, dwelling together, finally dwelling together, the marriage consummated. Of course, the sukkahs, or the booths, as some call them, in this paradigm, because, during the Feast of Sukkot, we dwell in temporary dwellings, temporary booths that represent the time when we wandered, or when our ancient cousins wandered in the wilderness and lived in tents, wandering. Well, the sukkahs, they're called sukkahs. The sukkahs, or the booths, represent the cohabiting of Yah with Yisrael. Why 7 days according to this paradigm? Why 7 days to the Feast of Sukkot? 7 days. Well, the week represents Yah, the husband, dwelling with his bride Yisrael here on earth for a defined period of time that is generally referred to as the millennial reign, or the kingdom of Yah here on earth. And the 8th day, the Shemini Atzeret, the last great day, otherwise known as that, one of those two, represents Yah dwelling with his people for eternity. And these 8 days emphasizes Yah's desire to dwell with his people. Now, in order to understand Passover, we're going to get back now and just really focus on the Feast of Passover. We're going to just drill down on Passover for the remainder of this discussion and the next two discussions, because we've kind of just given an all-inclusive, general 35,000-foot view of Yah's Moedim in his annual calendar. But now we're going to focus only on Passover, the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread, Passover Day, or Pesach, the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread, and even touch upon Yom HaNafat HaOmer, or the Day of the Wave Sheaf Offering. Okay? So in order to really kind of understand in this whole concept of Passover, we cannot get past one of the elephants in the room, if you will. And that has to do with physical circumcision. Physical circumcision weighed heavily among the males in Israel, especially the males who were of foreign origin. Physical circumcision factored heavily in regards to how or if one can keep Passover. And this continues to be a question in many folks' minds. Where or how does physical circumcision factor into anyone? Okay, let's be specific. Males. Where does physical circumcision play in this whole Passover discussion for males? Well, let's start at the beginning. Yah required that any male who would partake of the Pesach, the Passover lamb, that they be physically circumcised. Now, this was generally meant for the foreigners and sojourners who would come to be part of Yisrael and serve Yehovah. And the scriptural passage associated with this is Exodus or Shemot, chapter 12, specifically verses 48 and 49. For at the time that this mitzvah was given to Yisrael, the large part that would be departing or exiting out of Egypt, out of Mitzrayim, would be composed of what our English translations describe as a mixed multitude. Exodus or Shemot chapter 12, verse 38, as well as this mixed multitude context is described or enumerated in Numbers, no pun intended, Numbers or Bamidbar, chapter 11, verse 4. Now, these individuals and their families, if they did in fact have families, would have likely been non-Hebrews who were, of course, uncircumcised. Conversely, the departing Hebrews, because they were biological descendants of the patriarchs, would most likely have been circumcised at the time of the Exodus. And because Yah's focus at that time was to enter into a marriage agreement, a covenant agreement with Yisrael, his bride-to-be, it would fall upon any male who would partake of the Pesach, of the Passover lamb to be specific, to have the sign of the Abrahamic covenant applied to his flesh. And this has always been Yah's desire that any who were outside of the commonwealth of Yisrael be grafted in. Be grafted into the commonwealth of Yisrael. He never prohibited anyone who had the desire to be engrafted, to become part of Yisrael. He never prohibited outsiders from doing so. There were things they had to do in order to partake of the Passover. To be specific, there are other things we could discuss, but not here, not at this time, but being specific to the Passover, an outsider, a foreigner, was required to be circumcised. That is, become an Israelite. I'm not talking about a so-called spiritual Israel, which tends to conjure up a false concept of replacement theology, which I just can't stand. But I'm not talking about proselytizing the Gentile, such that the Gentile or the non-Jew seeking to enter into all of Israel's covenant promises and way of life must first become a Jew and then pledge themselves to be practitioners of Judaism. I'm not talking about those things. And this is where Judaism has lost her way as it relates to the relevancy and intent of physical circumcision. Yes, under the auspices of the original covenant, physical circumcision was a requirement for any male to partake of the Pesach. This is remember, we're talking about really the original covenant, the covenant that was given at Mount Sinai and given to our ancient cousins who departed out of Egypt. But things got a bit dicey in the first century, at the time of our master and of the original apostles, under the auspices of the renewed covenant. The elephant in the room at the time was What should the Jewish Messianics do with the influx of Gentiles, all of whom were no doubt uncircumcised, and these were coming into the faith, these non-Jews, these uncircumcised individuals? This question was made all the more troublesome when you factored in their keeping and partaking of Passover or Pesach. Although Passover was not directly addressed, this issue of what to do with the incoming Gentiles was the central point of discussion at the Jerusalem Council under the leadership of James, the biological half-brother of our Master Yehoshua. And this is all documented in Acts chapter 15. Contrary to the erroneous conventional wisdom of denominationalism, the Jerusalem Council in her final ruling did not abolish physical circumcision for the body of Mashiach, the body of Messiah, but rather the council, through her ruling, put physical circumcision into its proper perspective, which was to first and foremost acclimate the incoming non-Jews, the Gentiles, if you will, the uncircumcised ones, into the Hebrew faith by having them rid themselves of what? Of all vestiges of their former pagan lives. That they abstain from idolatry, abstain from fornication, follow the proper dietary rules or laws, and then not consume blood. Acts chapter 15, verses 19 and 20. These elementary mitzvot, these elementary commandments or instructions, were minimal requirements for a Gentile, a non-Jew, a ger, if you will, to come near and receive vital Torah instructions. Acts chapter 15, verse 21. And the Aramaic English New Testament reads, "For from ancient generations in all cities, Moshe had preachers in the synagogues that on every Shabbat they read him." Now, how this affected the converted, uncircumcised Gentile, the non-Jew, in his being permitted to partake of the Pesach in the first century. How did this affect them? Well, let's talk about this for a minute. And oh, by the way, Torah did not have such prohibitions on women as it related to their partaking of the Pesach. Since physical circumcision did not apply to girls and women, there were no mitzvot that prohibited them from partaking of the Pesach apart from any ritual purity issues that might prevent them from doing so at the time. However, there is evidence in some ancient writings that in the latter half of the first century, converted non-Jewish women had to go through proselytization. They had to be proselytized and commit to practicing Judaism in order for them to partake of the Pesach. This is in Jewish circles, okay? But back to our discussion on converted, uncircumcised non-Jewish men. The writings of 1st through 3rd century AD sages, rabbinic so-called sages, such as Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai and this guy, Rabbi Ishmael, suggested that these individuals were permitted to partake, these uncircumcised, converted Gentiles were permitted to partake in the so-called Jewish Seder by eating the elements of the Pesach meal, but they could not partake of the Pesach lamb, period. Needless to say, this situation placed tremendous pressure upon many of the unconverted, uncircumcised male believers of the Way movement back in the day. And many succumbed. They gave in to these pressures and they went ahead and got circumcised. At least that's what the context of some of these Jewish writings would suggest. But there were other concerns that crept into the discussion about converted Gentile males being circumcised. Essentially, who could perform the circumcision on these individuals so that it would qualify them to partake of the Pesach? And it seems from such previously stated Jewish writings that at the start of the first century, before the destruction of the temple, even as far back as Old Testament days, that it didn't matter who circumcised an individual or how one came to be circumcised. As long as one was circumcised, they passed the mitzvah muster. They passed the commandment rule for this. However, as the first century progressed, and we're talking about now getting past 70 AD, the time of the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, as that century progressed, the rabbis began to pass takana. Remember, takana, Jewish rabbinic halakha, laws or traditions or rules that carried the same authority and weight as Torah commandments. Well, the rabbis began to pass such takana that one who was circumcised, well, they had to prove they were circumcised with the expressed intent of practicing Judaism. There had to be a specific intent to become a proselyte in order for the circumcision to be valid. And still later on, that is well past the destruction of the temple, going into the latter part into the 2nd and 3rd century AD, that the intent wasn't the only requirement for circumcision. The intent to practice Judaism wasn't the only requirement, but it was added that an uncircumcised Gentile had to be circumcised by a qualified Jewish practitioner or a physician in order for their circumcision to be valid. And this mindset followed throughout the ensuing centuries, that in order for one to partake of Pesach, if they were male, had to not only be circumcised, but also a practicing Jewish convert. This also was applied to Gentile women. Women ultimately had to be converted to Judaism in order to partake of the Pesach. And this so-called fence that the rabbis placed around the keeping of Pesach by the Gentiles had to do with an intentional misunderstanding and misinterpretation of Torah on the part of the rabbis. Exodus or Shemot chapter 12, verse 43. No foreigner shall eat of it, the it being Pesach. You see, the rabbis taught that all non-Jews, all Gentiles, must be excluded from partaking of the Pesach. These are the latter first century rabbis. There was also growing sentiment of this during Paul's time, maybe even during and touching Yehoshua's time, the early part of the first century, but certainly during Paul's time, we started seeing this sentiment out there that all non-Jews were to be excluded from partaking of the Pesach. Because to the rabbis, all non-Jews, otherwise referred to as foreigners, were essentially idolaters. Non-Jews were considered idolaters, regardless of whether they're idolaters or not. You're an idolater. So if you're not a Jew, if you're not a proselyte, Jews were never considered as idolaters, however, unless they were convicted or caught practicing idolatry. But if you were a circumcised Orthodox Jew, you were never considered an idolater unless you were caught. You were a true idolater, but you got caught. In that case, the idolatrous Jew would be prohibited from ever partaking in the Pesach, or for that matter, being a member of the community. And this understanding again applied to both men and women. And the only way of being absolved of the title of idolater, one had to legally convert to Judaism by way of the established Jewish halakha. We know today that Yah is primarily concerned with the state of one's heart. Yah requires his beloved to be circumcised of heart first and foremost. Deuteronomy, or Devarim, chapter 10, verse 16. And the Robert Alter translation reads, "And you shall circumcise the foreskin of your heart." This is talking about both men and women. "Nor shall you show a stiff neck anymore." Also look at Deuteronomy, or Devarim, chapter 30, verse 6. The same Alter translation reads, "And the Lord your God shall circumcise your heart and the heart of your seed to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your being for your life's sake." On this issue of circumcision, Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul, wrote, and this is in Romans chapter 2, verses 28 and 29. The Aramaic English New Testament reads, verse 28, we're in chapter 2 of Romans, "For he is not a Jew who is so in what is external, or that which are external alone, nor is that only physical circumcision." You're not talking only about physical circumcision, which is visible in the flesh. Verse 29, "But he is a Jew who is so in what is hidden. And circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but from Elohim." And so in bringing this issue of circumcision and Pesach home, as it relates to one being circumcised in order for them to partake of the Pesach, it should be understood that first and foremost, one must be circumcised of heart. And this, of course, applies to both men and women. As I stated in our discussion on Yah's people being circumcised, I do not believe circumcision of the heart replaced the Torah mitzvah of physical circumcision. This is not the place, of course, to rehash that discussion, but if you're interested in where I stand personally on this very issue, I humbly invite you to read or listen to that discussion, which is entitled "Paul on Physical Circumcision for God's People, a Question of One's Jewishness," and that was the third part of a multi-series discussion on a question of one's Jewishness. I'll put the link to that specific discussion on circumcision in the transcript for this post. But in terms of one keeping Pesach and partaking of Pesach, and all that is associated with me. And let me just reiterate here. Let me be clear here. This is just Rod speaking. I truly believe any who is in covenant with Yah and who is circumcised of heart, they certainly qualify to partake of Pesach. Again, we can't and we don't keep Passover as it is ordered in Torah because we no longer have a functioning tabernacle or temple, nor do we have a functioning valid Levitical priesthood to officiate the proceedings. Instead, we keep Pesach in spirit and in truth. So then, however the body of Messiah, the body of Mashiach, is led to keep Pesach, to keep Passover is how we keep Pesach or Passover. And we keep Pesach with Yehoshua in mind. He is our Pesach today. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7. And we'll talk about this more as we get into keeping Passover under the auspices of the renewed covenant. But a Passover Seder should not be our focus this Passover. Although I have stated previously that I do not judge or any member of the body of Messiah who is led to participate in the so-called traditional Seder, the Jewish Seder, it serves only to place one under instructions and rules of the rabbis. We answer only to Yahushua, our master. But if you're led to keep a Passover Seder, to participate in a Passover Seder, and you feel that, it's the thing for you to do, go have at it. May you be blessed by that experience. But as long as you keep in mind the true meaning of Passover and keep the Pesach Seder in its proper perspective, it's just a tradition. Granted, a tradition that to me has some pagan leanings towards it. It's a rabbinic tradition that we have to be careful in how we relate to it and the amount of emphasis we place on it in our keeping of these set apart days. Now, I want to define the term Passover. More specifically, define the term Pesach. Now, before I get into this, I just want to offer my apology if I butcher any Hebrew stuff here, because I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I talked about that earlier in this post. So I'm going to do my best, tapping the height of my intelligence and knowledge of Hebrew, which is extremely limited. But our English term Passover in the Hebrew is Pesach. Pesach meaning let me spell it. P as in Paul, E-S-A-C-H. P-E-S-A-C-H. It's important why I spelled it, because we're going to get into some very similar sounding term here in just a second. Well, actually, we're going to get into it now, according to my notes. Because there is a noun and there is a verb version of Pesach that we should be aware of in terms of what the overall term actually means. First and foremost, our noun of Pesach, P-E-S-A-C-H, is drawn from the Hebrew verb Pasach, or Pesach, with P-A-S-A-C-H, P-A instead of P-E. So this is the root word, or the noun Pesach is drawn from this Hebrew verb Pasach, P-A-S-A-C-H. Pesach, P-A-S-A-C-H, carries a meaning of to limp, to jump, or to move with an uneven or an unsteady gait, such as one who hobbles along. And I got this terminology, this defining information from Messianic Torah author and teacher Tim Haig, who I reference quite often on this program, in his commentary entitled, "What Does the Word Passover, Pesach, Mean?" Always looking for more than one witness on a thing in my studies, which is what I routinely do. I consulted my trusty copy of Jeff A. Boehner's Ancient Hebrew Lexicon of the Bible and learned that the noun Pesach, P-E-S-A-C-H, means one who is lame, as in one who hops on one leg, while the verb Pesach, P-E-S-A-C-H, means to hop from one place to another. Now, the KJV, the King James Version, however, defines Pesach, P-E-S-A-C-H, as to pass over. Now, I pray that you're going to keep this all together in your mind, because this all comes together in a beautiful portrait here that if you're like me, really will appreciate and be extremely blessed by it. It turns out that the KJV, the King James Version, has been the source by which we get this sense of the destroyer passing over the homes of the Hebrews that had the Pesach lamb's blood applied to them. Pesach here, P-E-S-A-C-H. The Pesach's blood applied to the doorpost and lintel of the Hebrew dwellings. But see in our Hebrew definitions here that we somehow have to deal with this issue of one who is hobbled or lame, as the definition expresses. And we learn that Yah went through Mitzrayim. He went through Egypt on that solemn Passover night, and he struck down the firstborn of the homes where the blood of the Pesach had not been applied. And thus, Yah passes over the doors of those protected homes and does not permit the destroyer to come into those protected homes. Exodus or Shemot chapter 12, verses 12 and 24. Referring back to Tim Hegg, he highlights a very interesting concept to be understood regarding the use of the root term Pesach. P-A-S-A-C-H. We referred to it just earlier. The term Pesach throughout the Tanakh, the Old Testament, and we find in the story of Elijah's confrontation with the priest of Baal, we find the following. 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 21. And the Holman Christian Study Bible reads as follows. Then Elijah approached all the people and said, "How long will you hesitate?" Hesitate here is Pesach, P-A-S-A-C-H. How long will you Pesach between two opinions? If Jehovah is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him. But the people didn't answer him a word. Now, contextually speaking, when we factor into our understanding the phrase between two opinions, here in this passage of 1 Kings 18, verse 21, we arrive at a very poignant image, that of a bird jumping or hopping between various limbs and branches of a tree. Stay with me, beloved. This gets cool. Now, this is derived from the root word sa'af. Sa'af. S-A'-apostrophe-A-P-H. Sa'af, which means branches or a branch. Now, English translators chose the English term opinion to get their point across here. However, if we look at another Tanakh passage where Pesach, P-A-S-A-C-H, is used, we get a brilliant portrait of what is being conveyed. Isaiah chapter 31, verse 5. Isaiah 31, verse 5, and the Holman Christian Study Bible reads, "Like hovering birds, so the Lord of hosts, Jehovah Sabaoth, will protect Jerusalem. By protecting it, he will rescue it. By sparing it, he will deliver it." Let me read that again. Like hovering birds, so the Lord of hosts will protect Jerusalem. By protecting it, he will rescue it. By sparing it, he will deliver it. Now, Tim Hegg states that the Hebrew terms for defend, deliver, and preserve, these three terms, are joined together with the verb Pesach, P-A-S-A-C-H. And so Jehovah then here in this context is likened unto a mama bird, if you will, that hovers over her nest of baby birds, offering them sustenance and protection, and if necessary, rescuing them from predators. So Pesach, P-A-S-A-C-H, that root word, conveys that root word to Pesach, P-E-S-A-C-H. It conveys this sense of Yah protecting his beloved Yisrael from death. And so backing up to the Elijah story and the prophet criticizing the people that they were of two opinions as to which God they would serve, Jehovah or Baal, or Baal as some people call it. Our English term opinion or opinions in the plural could line up to mean branches. Therefore, we can imagine Elijah berating the people and telling them to, look, stop acting as birds, fluttering about between two limbs or branches, being unable to decide which God to serve. But then, from a contextual standpoint, apart from the Elijah story, we have this sense of a protective bird hovering over her children. And in this case, Yah, in the case of our Pesach, a Passover, the very first Passover as described in Exodus or Shemot chapter 12, Yah hovering over or hovering in a protective manner over the protected homes of, or the marked homes, I should say, of the Hebrews, of Yisrael. And Yah provides protection for Yisrael. Yah rescues Yisrael. Yah shields Yisrael. From what is he protecting or shielding or rescuing Yisrael? From the destroyer. Thus, it is Yah who protects Yisrael from the plague of death that went throughout Egypt and took the lives of the firstborn in the homes that were not marked by the Pesach lamb's blood. Now, I have thoughts as it relates to there being a death angel or Yah himself delivering the judgment, but for the sake of time, we'll simply leave it with how the passage describes the situation over in Exodus chapter 12, verses 12 and 13. The Altar version reads, "And I will cross through the land of Egypt on this night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, from man to beast, and from all the gods of Egypt I will exact retributions of I am the Lord." Verse 13, "And the blood will be a sign for you upon the houses in which you are. And I will see the blood, and I will pass over you. And no scourge shall become a destroyer amongst you when I strike in the land of Egypt." The rabbis believe that it was Yah, and Yah alone, who took the lives of the firstborn of Egypt, who were not covered by the blood of the Pesach. I further submit that Yah, in addition, personally protected each marked home from the destroyer. Who is the destroyer? Well, Altar suggests some type of evil spirit, and I tend to slightly agree with him. Thus, I believe that Yah, as he hopped or hobbled in a descriptive manner over the marked homes of the Hebrews and then through the land of Egypt, that he also protected. He, in a sense, as a protective mama bird, hovered. He rescued the Hebrews from the enemy who may have sought to go tit for tat and strike at the Hebrews for what was happening to the Egyptians. And that's just my thoughts on the matter. So, that's that for that. Let's look at now this. We're still talking about the basics of Passover, some basic concepts of Passover. We find in Genesis, or Bereshit, chapter 47, that Joseph, who was made viceroy over Egypt by Pharaoh, whose name is believed to have been dozier of the 18th dynasty, by the way. I find that fascinating. Because of his ability to interpret Dozier's dream and his ability to manage the affairs of Egypt, well, Dozier invited Joseph's entire family to reside in Egypt as a result of a famine that was devastating the entire Middle East region at that time. Joseph, who through recent archaeological excavations in Egypt, has been shown to have been given the name Imhotep. Imhotep. Given Joseph's revered, even supreme status in Egypt, his family, consisting of 70 souls at the start of their sojourn, enjoyed during the time of Joseph's and his brothers' lives privilege and honor in Egypt. And this is documented in Exodus or Shemot chapter 1, verses 6 through 10. However, after the deaths of the 12 patriarchs, a pharaoh who did not appreciate the historical legacy of the Hebrews in the land, whose identity is not readily known, by the way, well, he enslaved the patriarchs' descendants as foretold by Yah to Abraham back in Genesis, Bereshit chapter 15, verses 13 through 14. And the Robert Alter translation reads, "And he," the he being Jehovah, Yahweh Yahuwah, "said to Abram, know well that your seed shall be strangers in a land not theirs, and they shall be enslaved and afflicted 400 years. Verse 14. But upon the nation for whom they slave I will bring judgment, and afterward they shall come forth with great substance. Jump over to verse 16. And in the fourth generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full." The Pharaoh of the Exodus turns out to be Thutmose IV of the 18th dynasty, surnamed or otherwise named as Amenhotep, Amenhotep III. It was not Ramses, as historical tradition has erroneously put forth to an unsuspecting world for centuries. It was Amenhotep III, or Thutmose IV. Where am I getting this extra biblical information on Egypt and the pharaohs and such, and Joseph's name or Egyptian name and such? It's in this great book. If you have a lot of time and many brain cells to devote, I would highly recommend, I would greatly recommend you get this book by David Roll entitled Exodus, Myth or History. Exodus, Myth or History by David Roll. And Roll is spelled R-O-H-L. And David Roll is an archaeologist. I think he resides over in Spain at the moment. But he has done some phenomenal archaeological work over the last several decades in Egypt and in surrounding areas. And I'm telling you, what I'm telling you today here, it's nothing. When you get this book and you read it, it lays out before you a tremendous case of the Exodus and all the players therein with archaeological proofs that cannot be debunked, or that can't dissuade a reasonable person from understanding and knowing the truth. But check that book out. I think you can get it on Amazon. I actually attended one of his lectures at a conference, and I have never been the same. I've never looked at the Exodus story quite the same after meeting with him, or I actually got a chance to meet him, had lunch with him and a few others, and it was a wonderful opportunity and privilege. This was about 4 or 5 years ago. It's been a while, but I I didn't mean to get off track, but I know people want, well, where is he getting that information from? Well, I wanted you to know. So then, how long were the ancients then under bitter Egyptian bondage? Well, we find in Exodus or Shemot the following regarding the length of time the ancients were enslaved in Egypt. Although the text does not specify enslavement, just the time they dwelt in Egypt. And this is over in Exodus, Shemot, chapter 12. And the Robert Alter version reads, and this is in verse 37, and then we're going to jump over into verses 40 and 41, starting with 37. And the Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkot, some 600,000 men on foot, besides the little ones. Jump over to verse 40. And the settlement of the Israelites, which they had settled in Egypt, was 430 years. Verse 41. And it happened at the end of 430 years, and it happened on that very day, and the battalions of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. Again, that was Exodus chapter 12, verses 37, 40, and 41. Now, some rabbinic sources place the time in actual bondage between 86 to 116 years. And these are in some of their rabbinic writings, such as the Talmud Megillah 9 and Rashi on Exodus 12:40, and also Seder Olam Rabbah. These are ancient Jewish rabbinic writings. But this 86 to 116 years seems grossly unlikely, given Moshe recording that the mixed multitude that departed Goshen of Egypt totaled some 600,000 men, in addition to their families, which some have estimated the total number of people exiting Egypt to be somewhere in the area of 2 to 3 million souls. So if you're only talking 86 to 116 years for 70 Hebrews to multiply into 2 to 3 million people, I think that's ridiculous. And this has been the source of many people being confused and throwing and casting the scriptural record into doubt, so to speak. But I'm inclined to always trust and go with what Scripture says. What does Scripture say? And Yah told Abraham back in Genesis that his descendants would be enslaved and afflicted for some 400 years. And this is back in Bereshit, in Genesis 15, verses 13 and 14. And then Moshe reports that when Yisrael completed her business with Egypt, they lived there for some 430 years. They lived there 430 years. And this would make the best sense in terms of some 600,000 men along with their families departing out of Egypt at the start of the Exodus, as recorded in Exodus chapter 12, verses 37 through 41. Well, I've thrown a lot of background content at you regarding the basics of Passover and unleavened bread, and I pray that this information will provide you with some fundamental knowledge of Pesach that will serve you as you prepare to receive the coming set-apart days of Yah. It's not everything. I just scratched the surface on a few things that I thought that you could benefit from. But in part 2 of this discussion series, we will discuss keeping Passover by way of the original covenant. Okay? And with that, I'll see you on the other side in part 2.